Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. When I say I have a special treat for you today, I mean it. This is going to be different from what you're probably used to hearing anywhere ever when it comes to New Testament scholarship. Today, I'm joined by a professor who has dove, I think, to the deepest level you can when it comes to Pauline letters and understanding what is going on with these epistles that we find in our New Testament. She's done quite a bit of history research going through the scholarship and thought through this enigmatic character we call Paul that people are still arm wrestling over in the academic arena right now. And I have her name is Dr. Nina E. Livesey, and she has written a book. The book here is The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context. This is one of the most shocking reads I've read about the Apostle Paul, and I hope you will get yourself a copy. I understand the academic books are pricey. I have no control over that. She has no control over that. But I encourage you, if you do have a way of getting a copy, it is methodical and it is a new way to view how we should consider Paul's letters. That Dr. Livesey is a professor emerita of religious studies at the OU College of Professional and Continuing Studies, trained in biblical studies with a specialization in Pauline letters, as we said at the beginning. Nina's interests can be broadly characterized as the investigation into various aspects of Christian emergence. Her first monograph, and it goes, by the way, I'm getting this from the website. You got to look her up. You've got to see her background. But I can tell you this, I saw an interview from her years ago. She believed that the Apostle Paul's letters were authentic, and now we have a different Nina, and she told me I can call her Nina. So welcome to MythVision. How are you?
Thank you so much, Derek. And I appreciate your very kind introduction. And yes, you can call me Nina. I've asked my students to call me Nina, although they rarely do. In Oklahoma, we're still Professor Livesey. So I guess that's kind of nice too.
I might accidentally do that every once in a while.
How did I change my mind? Is that what you're asking me now?
I guess.
How did I come to have another really very divergent view with regard to the Pauline letters?
Right. Everyone thinks they're authentic. Everyone that I know thinks these are real. There's 7, but everyone I know, just for context for the viewer, that is critical, that is more in a, real critical scholarship, says some of these letters in our Bibles aren't really written by that guy. So they're willing to grant or concede inauthenticity to some degree, but there's 7 golden letters. You better not touch them. How did you go from a believer to a skeptic?
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. So it wasn't until 2018 that I began to question this so-called authentic perspective on the letters. And as you rightly noted, 7 of the letters in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul, we've long considered not authentic to Paul or pseudonymous. But those 7 letters have held firm, so-called 7 authentic letters: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those are what you would call the golden letters, the golden 7, authored by Paul, and also with the authentic perspective, they're genuine correspondence or sent letters, actual letter that was sent out, and on the whole, more or less historically reliable. A lot of work's been done on the letters, and we know there's many rhetorical moves within those letters. So it's not all historically reliable, but on the whole, we think of those as real letters authentic to Paul. So as you well noted, all of my training and even scholarship up to that point, 2018, assumed unquestionably the authentic perspective, and I had no strong reason to doubt it. But on a previous monograph, which is Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis, published in 2016 by Polbridge Press, it was there that I delved deeply into the rhetoric, especially of Galatians. And I became acutely aware, you might say, of the depth and breadth of authorial strategies within that letter. I also learned a lot more about ancient rhetoric. I delved into it pretty deeply. And I was really amazed to learn, too, that rhetoric, ancient rhetoric, was not considered merely ornamentation that an ancient author attaches to statements to make them more emphatic or emotive or grandiose, if you will. But instead, they consisted of a compendium of techniques for various types of creation, literary creation. So whole hog creation, you might say. So rhetorical training armed authors and epistolographers, letter writers, with various tools necessary for persuasive argumentation, but also things like character and situational development. So, for instance, ancient authors deployed a well-known rhetorical figure, prosopoiea, often called speech and character, which involved the invention of a speech and affixed to a character. That character could be a fictional character or a factual character. So that's a whole invention, you might say, of a character. And that was very popular, speech and character. And we've long known about speech and character in the world of Pauline studies. I later learned that a letter, however, can also be considered a form of speech and character. And I'll just let the audience think about that. I'm not going to go into details on it. But a letter could be a form of speech and character. So ideas are percolating, you might say, with that study, this deep dive into rhetoric. And so I came to the conclusion, even then in 2016, that elements within Galatians that had long been considered, or I considered on the whole, more or less historically reliable,
Mm-hmm.
especially the autobiographical statements in Galatians 1, the situation at Antioch with Peter, the showdown with Peter, you might say, or even the realia of the opponents were not necessarily so. Okay. This could also have been part of rhetorical recreations, you might say. And these were things percolating.
Hmm.
These episodes, as I said, could easily be authorial constructions. Significantly, that study placed me in the shoes, so to speak, of the author, which meant that I was led to largely consider, things like authorial purpose. Why say this? Why say it this way? And also the author's social location. What kind of an author would be saying these kinds of things? And what about his training? Wouldn't that author need to be trained in order to be able to say these things in a strategic way? Again, all these things are going through my mind. But then in 2018, I did some more work on ancient rhetoric, again with Galatians, again, largely focusing on that autobiographical passage in Galatians 1. And I gradually then started to doubt whether what we're seeing there is the Apostle Paul. The thought went through my mind, is what I will say. And then also, what about those other 6 letters? So were the letters staged as being in the name of the Apostle Paul? Remember, I talked a little bit about a letter being a form of speech and character. So there is already that happening in the ancient world. But I didn't put all those pieces together even then before I started writing the book and doing the research for the book. But also something else happened. And I was in conversation with a classicist colleague, and she actually pulled me aside at a meeting, and she mentioned to me that it's not so easy in the realm of classics to say with confidence who the author is of a particular work. So that made me put another seed in my thinking, you might say, that perhaps, or even more than perhaps, Pauline scholars were overconfident in their determination that the Apostle Paul wrote those letters. You know, if it's really difficult, how can we be so sure? As you said, it's the gold standard. We're just absolutely sure the Apostle Paul did that. But how is it that we know that? So with all those thoughts in my mind, I thought I'd better do some research on this. And so I set out to assess how authenticity came about for those 7 letters.
Wow. So much there. What I love about this opening, we'll get to the next question in just a second. What I love about this opening is I got to learn. See, it's like I watched the movie, your book, right? I read the book already. So the people who haven't read your book are at an unfortunate position to hear and know like all that we're getting into. But I'll say this. I arrogantly, okay, a while back, a couple years ago actually, kind of jabbed at this commenter who questioned Paul's letters, like the 7. I had just had Steve Mason on, and I thought, you are a crazy conspiracy person online, like da 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 da. Now, maybe they are, for all we know, but I, I had this confidence that we're listening to half a phone conversation in Paul's letters. They're authentic. You just grant it. And it's always felt that way. So to overturn the filling that we get, right? I'm using the word filling, is very difficult because you went through that. I want to almost say deconversion of the 7 authentic letters. Like you literally had to go through this same holy moly rhetorical stuff. And I felt that way when I read Stanley Stauer's book. When I went rereading Romans, something happened to me. I was like, hold on, all the commentaries I've ever read on this, like they're reading, here's this authentic guy who's just speaking these like theological things. And he's like, no, it's like a philosophical, like your inner man struggle kind of like, go look at Plutarch. And I'm like, whoa. And then Medea being quoted in Romans 7 and all this. And I'm like, what am I reading? I don't even know what I'm reading anymore with Paul, right? So anyway, enough about me. I just want to make the point that I've been guilty of just outright dismissing these kind of ideas. And here we are today after reading a book going, I had no idea how complicated it really is. So our first question that I think really needs to be spelled out is, you approached this differently as you described in the opening here than any of the prior people who doubted some of those 7 even, which are some of the Dutch radicals. Can you take us through the history of the scholarship, which was a powerful point early on in your book, on Paul's letters and how we came to view them as historical letters? Dutch radicals, of course, had like 4, depending on which guy. But they doubted some of the things we're not willing to doubt. Can you tell us the history of the scholarship of Paul, why we think the 7, and I don't know, just kind of take it at your own pace in whatever direction you think is necessary for our audience to understand that.
Yes. Well, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Stanley Stowers. And I would like to say that he, over the last 20 years, has had a large influence on me. He's done a lot of work, especially on speech and character, and I've long been positively influenced by his work. And in other ways, he's influenced this current study, but I won't go into that. But Shout out to Stan Stowers for sure. I can't do the whole history of the scholarship, but I can briefly review things. I can hit the highlights. As you say, the book goes into a lot more depth. But I can bring out some of the touch points, you might say. So for the history, I turn both to early readers, but also and largely to important moments and influential scholars of the modern period. And I focus there because the current authentic perspective on the seven letters is itself modern, I learned. And it comes, I think, also from a particular modern mode of thought, how we think about those letters. I think it's a modern notion to think about them as authentic. And all of this I learned in the course of the research on the book. So some takeaways. I'm going to highlight some important takeaways. I found that predetermined notions of Christian origins in particular bring the authentic perspective to the fore against the modern notion of the authentic perspective. Pauline letters become assessed as authentic as those predetermined notions are read back into the letters. So some examples. And I do focus on F.C. Bauer and Adolf Deisman. So in the first, the prominent 19th century F.C. Bauer, he deemed 4 Pauline letters authentic, and only 4, not 7, 4, and thereby historically reliable. According to him, the 4 well reflect the emergence of Christianity, again, Christian origins, in the first century. But his religious views and socio-political situation in Germany at that time are determinative of his estimation of the authenticity of the letters. What he does is he reads strategically 1 Corinthians 1, 11 to 12, which is a debate between various figures there. You'll have to look up the passage. I don't have it in front of me.
No sweat.
But so it's 1 Corinthians 1, 11 to 12. And he sees that dispute or debate among 4 figures as confirming 2 different religious perspectives. One, a universalistic law-free one, you've probably heard that before, represented by Paul, no law, Paul and without the law, and his non-Jewish group, that's one faction, you might say, and then a particularist, sorry about that, law-bound version of Christianity, and that's represented by Peter and his group. So you now have some opposition, Jewish-Christian opposition, although that's a little anachronistic to talk about it like that. But that passage pops for Bauer, you might say, but it confirms his own religious understanding, which is supersessionistic, okay? Christianity over Judaism, you might say. So Bauer was equally able to find evidence of that type of split from Judaism into Christianity, you might say. And for Bauer, it was like that in 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. So this is how you get those 4 chief epistles or Hofbriefe.
Just for clarity for our viewers, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want them to understand that debate, that tussle that we see between Peter and Paul in Galatians or 1 Corinthians. You even get a hint of it in Romans, I think, but you're saying that they're looking at that debate. Bauer's looking at this and he's going, look, it's no more law, right? It's superseded the Judaic law. And because he has this theological baggage of what he has interpreted Christianity's Pauline letters to be about, he then approaches them and goes, okay, if I could find this in these letters, it's authentic, kind of circular there.
Right.
So you pull the rug out from that. We got a problem. Now we got to try and figure out what is happening in these texts. But okay, sorry, please continue. I just want the viewer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is circular. He reads his contemporary theology and the social political context, which I'm not going into now, but it is in the book. He reads that into the letters. So what you could say then, in analyzing what he's doing, is he's historicizing his theology. He's making that theology real, you might say. That's really how it was. But it's influenced by his own contemporary theology, so it's already very anachronistic, right? It's a modern perspective that he's reading back in to the first century. So there's Bauer, and Bauer grounds a lot of the authentic perspective, because with him you have those 4 chief epistles. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but those 4, you get the 7 built from the 4.
Got
so
it.
You need those 4 chief epistles. And if you look at Pauline scholarship, they are the ones that garner most of the scholarship, those chief epistles. They're still known as, whether we acknowledge it or not, as chief epistles, even though we don't call them chief epistles so much anymore. But they are the primary, I guess you might say, a lot of the theology is in those 4 letters, or can be gleaned from those 4 letters. So what happens after Bauer? I can continue a little bit with this history. Chronologically speaking, okay, so we were at the mid-1800s, but at the end of the 1800s, there are these folks, as you've mentioned, Derek, these Dutch radical thinkers, and they do play a role. I can mention some of them. Bruno Bauer, he's one of the lead Dutch radicals. Abraham Lohman, Rudolf Steck, and Wilhelm von Manen. They go further than Bauer, you might say. They do not hold to the chief epistles, those 4 authentic letters. They deny authenticity to the whole lot of the letters, all of them, all 13 or all 14, depending on whether or not you want to count Hebrews. They're all pseudepigrapha for the Dutch radicals. And their thoughts did play a role as kind of background in my own thinking. I read them and then came to my own views about what's going on, but their views were, I think, still valid, even at the end of my research. Wow. So what they say, and you'll see this repeated quite a bit in that scholarship, that the letters provide evidence of an advanced level of theological reflection on the part of Paul. And for them, that means that the letters are derivative of the Gospels and Acts. I come to a similar conclusion at the end of my study. But then that also, a similar conclusion that I come to, it undermines that traditional dating that is affixed also to the authentic perspective, where the Pauline letters, those 7, are considered the very earliest writings that we have, right? They come from the 50s in the traditional scholarship.
If I may, just so I understood what you just said there, other than the fact that the anchoring, of course, and I imagine we'll get a little bit into why people anchor these things when they do. But when you said that they thought that these letters were derivative of the Gospels, that these are the Dutch radicals, and you yourself also are sympathetic to this view, is that, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just rewording it to maybe make it clear for our audience that they understand, I think, what I'm interpreting this to mean. Like even Christians today will go, Paul has high Christology, right? They always talk about this as if that's a gotcha, because the standard model is Paul's the earliest, and then, or the seven, right? They're willing to play in that sandbox with critical scholars, though they want to say all 14 are real, or 13, however, depends on the Christian.
Yeah.
But it is very sophisticated theological thinking, and it's what, a decade or two after Jesus, we're supposed to have like this extremely well theologically thought out thinker. Now, some dispute that, but you're suggesting that this seems to imply, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, or add or subtract or whatever, that they might actually be derivative of an already existing gospel stories that we have in the New Testament, and these letters are derivative of that. They're highly sophisticated, and that plays a role. Or am I missing something here?
Well, I guess I wouldn't go too far on that word derivative. What I mean is deriving chronologically.
Right.
So I do think you need to have some of the main narrative laid out before you can have theological reflection. So in that way, you do have some conceptual notion of deriving. But what was interesting about the Dutch radicals is that this Paul, to have that higher level of reflection, meant Paul came later. Maybe that is a clearer way of saying what I'm trying to say here. Paul, there must have been some time for reflection. What could the crucifixion have meant, right? Because you do see reflection on the crucifixion with the letters of Paul, right? He applies it to himself in terms of suffering. Paul is a sufferer, okay? And these are things that the Dutch radicals were already observing when they looked at the letters, which made them think that the letters had to come later. Is that
Yeah, that
better?
makes
That
sense.
makes better sense.
And I imagine there's a lot more, right, that they have to say
Right,
about these problems.
right.
I've heard that it looks like disputes that are going on, and that this is just from a friend and scholar, Dr. Robert M. Price, that I've studied with for years back in the day. He said that it's like they call them patchwork quilts, where there's disputes in the second century that the Dutch radicals thought this looks like an argument that's happening later, but they're like the different groups of thinkers of Christians. And so we're assuming this is happening in the 50s, but they thought, no, this seems to reflect Christian problems in the second century or something like that too. But I can't remember exactly the detail.
Right. So it was interesting to read Dutch radical thought, and especially after I finished all the research, to go back and see, yeah, okay, I can see why you're saying that after I had done all my own research. So I found that worthwhile, to look at all of that scholarship on the Dutch radicals. So another major voice influencing the authentic perspective was the early 20th century scholar Adolf Deismann. You might think of him as epistolary scholar, did a lot of work on the letters. But he, like Bauer, reads his own notions into the letters too to determine their authentic. And in this case, he reads his romantic notions of Christian origins into Pauline letters. For him, unlike Bauer, all the letters are authentic, all 13 of them. He excludes Hebrews. They're all, but for Deismann, the important point is they're real letters. They're genuine sent correspondence. And that is the contribution I find that he makes to the authentic perspective. So in other words, rather than on the historical reliability, which you can affix to Bauer. For Deisman, it's the letter, the genre. He contributes to how we think about the letter itself as being sent correspondence, a real letter. So he grounds the letter in history.
Hmm.
You can also, because of where he's placed in this brief chronological survey that I'm giving you here, he comes after the Dutch radical thought, and you can consider his views as a response to the Dutch radicals, because he's veering very strongly to the other direction.
Right.
Grounding everything in history. What were the Dutch radicals doing? Taking everything out of history, right? So you've got two opposing views here. But Deisman, and because of the authentic perspective, Deisman ends up carrying the day, Deisman and Bauer. So for Deisman, Christianity originated in an ahistorical, pristine, you could call it a Garden of Eden-like setting. And he has a term for that, primitive Christianity or Ur-Christendom. And for him, he envisioned it as a time when the Spirit, you might think the Holy Spirit, was alive and active, and it was leading the earliest Christian community. And those early Christians were themselves simple persons and barely literate themselves. Their writings, according to him, are also barely literate, more like oral speech, and it was spirit directed. So, something very different, as you're probably hearing now. And according to him, the genuineness of the letters is evident in the style. So he reads those letters, Pauline letters, as being very simple and very honest and very spontaneous, because after all, they reflect that earliest period. So the status of the letters as genuine and stylistically simple and spontaneous also relies on circular logic, right?
Right.
He reads the letters through the lens of his predetermined understanding of Christian emergence. And for him, it's partly his theology, because that's got to be, his theology was this simple, pure period, as I said, Garden of Eden type beginnings to Christianity. And he's reading that, as I said, back into the letters. And what happens then is, even as the scholarship says, no, 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 those letters aren't simple, your methodology is not correct, you can't say it like this. And that came swift and forcefully against Deisman after he published his big work. But even with all of that, the notion that those letters are real letters, sent correspondence, that took hold and continues. Even though, as I say in the book, the bases of all of his reasoning was undermined in the scholarship.
Hmm.
So, to conclude this brief history, I came to the understanding that the conceptual basis of authenticity is rooted on the one hand with Bauer in Christian triumphalist theology, and on the other hand with Deisman in Romanticism.
Wow. Okay, that is a powerful lens that I think anyone who's looking at Paul's letters needs to know. It's like saying, "Hey, I have a product." I'm using analogy. I have a product here that is supposed to help you cure this thing. And it's fantastic. And then you find out studies 20 years ago, it gave cancer to some patients and it had this and that. Like, you kind of need to know the fine print and the history behind something that you're accepting today. And you have no clue where they were or potential, pitfalls that can be today. So in my mind,
Mhm.
the question I have just before we exit that question to the next one is it your observation after researching Deisman and others? Really, I have a two-pronged question,
Mhm.
and that is, do you think, even though scholars immediately want to criticize his kind of spirit-filled observation, his romantic view of the origins, that it's divinely, it's got all the inspiration of like real divinity involved in making this happen, which for me, I like to level the playing field and go, okay, how did the cult of Attis, how did the cult of Apollonius, how did the cult of Jesus, how did the, that's how I work. But like, do you think that people today in Pauline scholarship are just taking for granted what was built by Bauer and Deisman here, just trying to kind of eliminate that romantic view of, well, this is the Garden of Eden origin of Christianity, which we kind of get in the New Testament, even? It kind of reflects these ideas. And then with that, you go into Deisman a little more in your book, well, way more in your book. But is it Deisman that did all the heavy lifting, and I'm using scare quotes here, of trying to compare the Pauline letters with like all of these other letters that really did not help the case of him trying to say, oh, we found them and they look so similar to these other letters, but they're not actually like epistles a lot of times that he would compare them to? Is it Deisman, or who was the scholar that did that, but it really actually worked against that?
Right.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yes. It's a good question. I'll try to answer it in two ways. Do I think people are thinking about Bauer and Deisman when they're assuming this authentic perspective on seven letters? I would say I doubt that. I think the field has simply assumed and moved on that the seven letters are authentic. And so, with that little brief history, I'm kind of muddying the waters. This is the authentic perspective. And in this little patch of muddying, you might say, I'm giving you what it's based on conceptually. So there's other muddying that I do as well. So that answers one part.
Yes.
So I don't think people are consciously thinking about Bauer and Deisman. I think they've moved on because they've accepted, right, these seven letters as being authentic. They're not questioning them at all. As I said, I'm asking it to be rethought. I'm asking that the seven letters, authentic letters, be rethought. And then your other question, does Deisman do the heavy lifting of comparing letters to real letters? He does some of that to make his point that Pauline letters are indeed simple, ordinary letters. Um, he actually does quite a bit of that work. But some of it is not very convincing. The primary work, however, was done after Deisman, where scholars thought, it's important to start looking at letters and start looking at epistles themselves. Deisman gets that ball rolling, and other scholars after Deisman do more work, and it's more sophisticated, I think, theoretically sophisticated. Those that follow Deisman, there's other people that do that work. And perhaps I'll get into that with some of your other questions.
Sure. Yeah, because that's a that's an important revelation, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
My next question is: when I read Acts, I see companionship between Peter and Paul to some degree. If Paul and Peter have a pissing contest in Galatians, do you see this as a way these letters make Paul superior to Peter? If I may, just to kind of context for viewers, I have heard it said from Bart Airman and everybody, right? The original earlier is here's Paul having a pissing contest with Peter, and they're not friends. They're clearly not happy with each other. And Paul's angry. You could tell he's not a fan of Peter and what Peter did to the Gentiles and Galatia. Okay. Well, Acts paints a different picture, according to him. And he would say that what Acts is doing later, notice the chronology change from what you're suggesting, later, they're patching up this rift that's in the early church, which Paul has. You're saying, let's turn the camera upside down. So help us with what you see going on in Acts and how we can reevaluate with a different lens if the letters come after.
Okay. I'll
That's
try
a
to do
lot.
I'll try to do my best. Well, when you look at Acts, you can see, just giving a big overview here, you can see that Peter is more or less the main character at the beginning of Acts, right? And Paul then becomes a leading character in the second half of Acts. And they do seem to have slightly different theologies, you might say, between Peter and Paul. What I do see, but where I focus really more is on the letters. And in Galatians 2, you can certainly see that Paul is subordinating Peter. He publicly rebukes him in front of people there in Galatians 2. So I can see where you would say that, and I don't disagree with you. I don't spend a lot of time in the book going through that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll take this in a slightly different direction. Based on modern epistolary theory, I indicate in the book that, so I see a connection then with epistolary scholarship. Epistolographers of pseudonymous letter collections take a known figure into portrayals different from how they're otherwise known. Indeed, this appears to be a dominant characteristic in that type of letter, pseudonymous letter collections. That is to redirect the character. Thus, if Peter was seen as a central figure and more significant than Paul in some literature, as you're implying,
Mm-hmm.
the letter in the name of Paul could serve itself, a letter, as a type of correction and to revise the scenario. So I'm moving your question more into the realm of the power of the letter, if you will.
Right.
In addition, I mentioned in especially chapter 3 of the book that a letter privileges, this is just reiterating what I've said, the voice of that inscribed letter sender figure. Here it's Paul again, right? It's his show, and I'm saying his. A lot of these ancient epistles, all that I've looked at are in the name of males, right?
Right.
So because all the letters are attributed to Paul, better the Apostle Paul, there's, by virtue of the letter genre, a sense of his authority and the centrality of that figure. Coupled with that, ancient readers came to expect that. They knew that, they wanted that, according to the literature that I reviewed. They're looking for that figure, the letter writer figure, to be the one in the know, the one who has the authority. So you might say then it's interesting that you have letters from the Apostle Paul, because in a letter he can organically be superior to another character.
Mm.
After all, as I said, it's his show. So you could see something like this, and it seems normal too. Look, Peter, yada yada, But it's his show. He can easily do that in a letter. Or I'm saying it's not actually Paul, but I'm using him at this point to explain what I'm saying. And finally, if this came up recently, and I'll just mention it as an aside, if you can trust the recreated contents of Marcion's collection of Pauline letters. There's 10 letters that Marcion published in the middle of the 2nd century. And I'll probably get a little bit into that later on here. But if you can trust those recreations, I noticed that there's no definite, explicitly mentioned co-senders, and I found that interesting. So in the canonical letters, you'll often see Apostle Paul and Timothy, my brother, something like that, as the implied letter senders. But in Marcion, it's only the Apostle Paul. I found that interesting.
Hmm.
So I think I'll leave it with that. And I don't know if I've completely answered your question,
No,
but
it's a great leap. I think what we can do too for the viewer is paint a different picture, right? Again, we're trying our best with the evidence and ways of looking at this literature, which I think later we can get into, where you actually show the kind of genre the letters of Paul seem to reflect more than any of the other stuff that seems to be authentic. There's like this cumulative case people have to try and consider and rethink through, because a lot of the scholarship we're reading, all they are is kind of hypothetical, tools to try and assess this stuff, and a lot of it is circular, like you said. So when I read Acts, I read I, I read a. I know that scholars get picky about the details of historical fiction or fiction of history or whatever. Like for me, it's very fictional and it's placed in a setting. Of course, it tries to put itself in a historical setting, but it's very fictional sounding from the very get go. Guys are floating into the clouds. There's just really fantastic material all throughout, and I know that a lot of people who are more more fundamentalist, they take offense to that and act like, well, that's your anti-supernatural bias. I would do it for Apollonius. I would do it for Asclepius. I would do it for anybody else. I'm just saying I see it here. It's doing the same kinds of things. You see it with the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Your book highlighted a scholar that I read a while ago and even interviewed, Michael Koshinosh's work, where he wrote a letter, or he wrote a article called Better Call Paul Saul. And it rocked my world because he goes through the scholarship on what did the scholars think about Paul Saul, the guy named Paul, and he was called Saul. And then they were like, okay, his Jewish name is Saul, his Roman name is Paul, and like they had these like historicizing methods of explaining him in Acts, right, as this authentic person. And then Kashinosh just took his hot knife off the stove, grabbed the butter, and just right through it and said, ladies and gentlemen, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? From the Septuagint is practically a verbatim quote, a mimetic connection to when King David, Jesus is a son of King David, he is inheriting, he's a seed of David. Here he is crying to another Saul, right? Just fulfilling scripture. And he's saying, why are you persecuting me? And then he adds a little interesting layer to that about the Bacchae that I love as well, with the bright light and all that, with Pentheus and the tree and you name it. We won't get caught up in that. But it's a fantastic article. Blew my mind, and it made me go, I can't read Acts the same way anymore. Then your book echoes that and says, here's this really popular name, this guy named Paul, from a very powerful story in Acts, and that guy is now an authority in this movement, and they're writing letters using that authority's name from a story. And I'm like, what just happened to my brain? Sorry I rambled there. I'm just trying to
yeah,
give a little more detail for viewers to understand, like, kind of what happened while I was reading your book.
right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. And that transformation from Saul or Saulos to Paulos or Paul is very central to that book, to my book. And I do know the article that you're referring to. Acts plays with names, strategically plays with names. So yeah, it was a very good point that you've made, Derek.
Thank you so much. I'm just trying to compliment because this is truly a fun, amazing book. Anyway, number 3 is
Thank you.
what I mean. This ties into Acts actually. One example, at least in Acts, and then you get in the letters of Paul. What makes scholarship think the 7 are authentic, and how do they anchor them? That's the key, right? Because we already know we kind of touched on why they think they're authentic, and like, but they're even today when they get rid of the romanticism and they don't accept the whole idea of like, I must have this spiritual explanation to make sense of the origins. What do they anchor them to? What makes them say these 7 are historical and they're in the mid 50s or 40s of the first century? And why is this a problem?
Okay. Well, thank you for this question. So I looked into that, and not exactly the way you've framed it up, but very closely. Um, Post Bauer, late 19th and early 20th century continental scholars, largely from Germany, but also from France, they started also re-investigating this question of authenticity. And they start with this Hauptbriefe, or the chief epistles of Bauer. That's their starting point, which I've mentioned. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. They just assume that those are authentic. They buy into that. Okay, these scholars, these later than Bauer scholars, and what they do is they gradually add 3 more letters, which they believe corroborate, you might say, the theology, or the views, maybe better to say the views, but also the theology that they find, and style that they find within those 4 letters. So that's how you get those additional 3 to bring it up to 7. The criteria, however, that they use was not very rigorous at all, and it would not come up to modern standards of analysis or investigation at all. Some of it is one of the scholars wanted to include Philippians because it had his favorite expression in there, so it certainly had to be a genuine Pauline letter. So this is the way in which more letters are grounded, you might say, into history through an analysis of some more letters of Paul. And I'm going over this very briefly.
Of course,
I go into more detail within the book. So
get the
what I've
book,
just
ladies and
said is,
gentlemen.
yeah, thank you so much. I found this quote, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. It was influential to me, and I think it'll give you an idea of what those scholars had in the back of their mind. They needed, in a way, to find more letters. And this is interestingly articulated by this British professor of divinity at Durham University, um, who writes, every student of apologetic theology in England is aware how much stress has recently laid upon what is called the argument from the Pauline epistles for the historical basis of the life of Jesus. This argument has been confined for the most part to those 4 epistles, the chief epistles, which are regarded as practically undisputed. But the course of modern criticism increasingly justifies us in adding to the number at least 3 others: First Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. And even at the time, the scholar is already waffling a little bit to include Colossians in there as well. So that gives you an idea. There was, you might say, pressure from a theological basis again to have more Pauline authentic letters. Anyway, that's why I thought I'd read that quote to give that idea, make that idea become more plain. In addition to grounding the letters, as I've just mentioned, other areas of investigation led me again and again to the conclusion that the authentic or historical perspective on the seven letters was what I'm calling forced. So, for instance, scholars looked at Pauline chronology. And for this, what was the order? These are genuine letters, real letters of Paul. So scholars wanted to say which was the first letter that Paul wrote, which was the second, third, fourth. So there is scholarship on Pauline chronology. But that is also circular. It assumes what the sequence is supposed to reveal. Okay, that scholarship is dubious, you might say, this Pauline chronology. Again, it's based on circular logic. Then I found other studies that look to locate Paul, of course, the author, the assumed author, right? They want to find him historical. And to do this, they look at particular passages, often what they call autobiographical passages, and two that I write about more extensively in the book. One is from Acts and one is from 2 Corinthians. So in 2 Corinthians 11:32 to 33, you see the Apostle Paul is in Damascus, and he's threatened by the governor of King Aretas. Or in Acts 18:12 to 17, Paul is seen in Corinth before Gallio, and he's defending himself against accusations brought by Jews. That's in Acts. But as I mentioned, that also has some theoretical problems to rely on Pauline historicity based on those passages. It's methodologically flawed because you cannot find another source that can confirm Paul or the Apostle Paul with those otherwise known figures, right? There isn't any other mention of that. So it's also, and I mentioned in the book, not difficult really to ascertain that those incidents add dramatic effect, whether that be in Corinthians or in Acts, to advance the theological goals. So in the one passage, Paul escapes by being let down in a basket through a window. It's quite dramatic, right? And that scene, however, it occurs elsewhere in Scripture. So it's kind of, you could think of it as a set escape piece. So the historicity is already crumbling, you might say, around somebody who necessarily drops down in a basket. You've got that with Rahab already in Joshua. Rahab is letting the spies down, isn't she, to escape in the book of Joshua. So we've already seen that basket motif. And in the second passage, Paul's defense against hostile Jews, that's a very dominant theme in Acts, where you see kind of the justification, you might even say, of the Jesus movement to Gentiles as the Jews are rejecting it. That goes all the way through Acts. So Paul's appearance before Gallio contributes. It's very central to that theme. I'll also mention that to name a known figure, a distinctive figure, adds a sense of verisimilitude to the writings. We know that. We've known that for a long time. So this name dropping has rhetorical and literary cachet, you might say. Modern epistolary scholarship likewise contributes to the historicizing agenda of the seven letters. Pauline letters, and now I'm getting to those people who come after Deismann, pick up from Deismann and carry his ideas forward. Again, epistolary scholarship. So Pauline letters are said to be genuine, sent correspondence, even as the evidence for that view says otherwise. The Pauline letters variously don't conform by their form, their structure, their length, or their content to those to other letters that you would think of are genuine letters in history, like a son writing to his parent. Those are very simple letters, and the Pauline letters are theological, more complex. Even their very structure is different. So, in the face of these multiple instances of disconformity, again, within this epistolary zone, you might say, I found it interesting. The scholars were dismissive, even though their findings did not yield what they set out to perform, but they went ahead and they still say the letters are genuine, and they rationalize it now and say that Paul's pressing mission, he's on a mission to convert the Gentiles, that caused him to change the letter form. I didn't find that very convincing. So this type of evaluation also makes Pauline letters a category to themselves, which is also not very convincing, that you'd have a unique type of ancient letter.
So this is great. In your book, I get to this spot where you talk about Acts, and you point out how Acts doesn't get chronology right. Of course, Steve Mason's work with the idea of showing Josephus is, if there's historicity influencing from a well-known historian, looks like Acts is lifting, which now you got to at least date Acts after 94, whenever he wrote that writing. And then what's interesting is the chronology and the mistakes that Acts makes historically. So the question I have, right, because I just encourage people to read the book. I love those moments where you're like, oh, yep, these are just errors, mistakes that take place. And I find it interesting to watch apologetic videos. Some of the people that did a video response to you, right, they'll spend like 2 hours trying to defend like these little things that like Pervo already wrote about, and it's like critical scholarship is like moved forward and went, okay, what are we trying to defend here? Why are we trying to protect this? It's pretty obvious. So in my question is the relationship of Paul's letters to Acts, and just this in light of what you just answered about anchoring it. Scholars point out, some will go, Acts doesn't know, like even Bart Airman, right? Which, by the way, he does this a lot. He just super dismissive of connections, unless like he found a letter that said, I am connecting this. It's like very hard to convince someone like him. For me, I'm not as like resistant to these things. Would you say that the geographical movement of Paul within Acts inspires or influences the letter locations of the letters of Paul, and where the travel of this character we want to call Paul in the letters goes? So it's using Acts, or these letters are using Acts as inspiration for saying, okay, here he is at Philippi, or here he is headed to Corinth, or here he is, blah, blah, blah. Philippians talks about him wanting to go to Rome. Like, they're looking back to Acts and the geographic movement of this character in this story of Acts. Is that inspiring the letters in your view of where he's going? Because a lot of scholars try to go, okay, look in the letter. He's writing to Rome. He never went there. Okay. And they work backwards to try and go, now how does this influence Acts? You see what I mean?
Right. And I do see that. I do see that you might say ideas for the community destinations do come from Acts, because there are parallels for sure. I think you can line up all of those letters with places of travel found in Acts. So, I asked myself, well, how do we have Corinth, the Corinthians? Well, that does show up in Acts, right? Paul is in Corinth. So I do see a relationship there,
Mm.
definitely. Um, so thank you for asking that.
Using
It might not line up exactly, but I don't know that it needs to line up exactly,
Mhm.
right? The letters are doing something different. We have a different Apostle Paul, and I think that's the purpose of the letters, is to recharacterize Paul and make him actually into, or more into, an authoritative figure as squarely as an apostle, and take him into new directions, but influenced by that character that we find in Acts, going back to the Saul Paul motif that you mentioned. That there we have the Paul character.
Thank you, thank you. Nina, what examples do you have that show the letters are fictive?
Thank you for the question. It's perhaps a harder question. Um, I go about this in two ways. One, I show that as a collection, which is our only, and I'll use the word firm evidence of the letters, Pauline letters conform to a known and popular genre of letters called pseudonymous letter collection. I've already referred to that a little bit. The modern epistolary scholar Owen Hodkinson writes, and I'm learning about this as I'm going too, and amazed really by what he has to say, that this genre of letter is far the most frequent type of Greek letter from all periods. Fictive pseudonymous letter collection, okay? The genre emerges in the first or second century, and it's often associated with a period called the Second Sophistic. And while fictive, however, they do not have a serious intent to deceive. I won't go into that, but to focus so much on forced forgery, I think, is definitely not the way to go. And it never went through my mind at all when I was writing the book that these are forgeries. I didn't consider that at all. So they're not seriously intended to deceive. It's just, this is a way of getting ideas across through a letter. You can think of it as that. They were thus very popular. So in the book, I say that Pauline letters do conform in strategic ways as a Pauline letter collection, which has some common characteristics. So I'm doing comparative work here now. What they are intended to do is to extend the characterization or the character portrayal of a known figure. The figure can be factual or fictive, and take that character in new directions. And we've already mentioned just a few minutes ago that the letters take that character of Acts into new directions. So that, and we've known that in scholarship for a long time, namely that the character in Paul in Acts is different from the Paul of the letters. So that's already well known. Another characteristic, and this is a little complicated, I'm not going to go into it, but I do in the book, they refer to letter writing activity. It seems like a minor point, but it's an interesting one. And what that is intended to do is satisfy readers. So it's envisioning savvy readers who, even though they know the letters are fictive, they want to have the sense that they're reading a real letter, an authentic letter. And so the writers of the letter end up satisfying that urge on the part of the readers by talking about letter writing activity. For instance, they would drop a line, by the way, I sent a letter to Cornelius yesterday. And so those instances of realia, you might say, are characteristic of this pseudonymous letter collection. And you do see, if you look, there are many instances of references to letters or letter writing activity within the Pauline collection. So that conforms as well. And the other thing is there's no real logical chronology with these letters. It's just a group of letters. And we don't have any other than these forced chronologies with the Pauline letters. And you also see instances where letters are added. And with the Pauline collection, we've known, or most scholars have known for a long time, that the pastorals seem to come later, right? Regardless of how you want to negotiate that question of authenticity, the pastorals are thought to have come at a later time. So you see adding and the ability to add to the collections. And the second thing that I do to show the fictive nature, and there's a long chapter 3 in the book where I compare, it's all in chapter 3, I compare canonical Pauline letters to what we know for sure. We have lots of certainty, I might say. I don't know if you can say anything for sure. That's why I hesitated there. That Seneca's moral epistles are fictive. So I compare then Pauline letters to a known fictive collection of letters. And I do that along 3 lines. What I'm trying to find out are the strategies. So I lean on, you might say, Seneca to see what he does with his addressee, Lucilius, who we know is fictive. So how is Seneca using Lucilius to his advantage to make it seem like a real letter? So you have engagement. So I look at that, and then I can look back at the Pauline letters, and I could see how the author there, now I refer to that as an author of Pauline letters, is having the Apostle Paul engage with with communities, right? To make that more lively. I can do comparisons along that area, in that realm. And I do the same with situational setup. And I find in Seneca, he often will start, and the letters are heavy. The Stoic philosophy is all in these moral epistles. It's dry, it's heavy, it's heavy going, you might say, in reading. But in a letter, he can lighten it up and he can make it more interesting. And one of the ways that he does that is he sets it up. He sets up the heavy teaching with a light dialogue, light and breezy dialogue. Like, Lucilius, I saw you yesterday and I was thinking about you. You're often absent. And then Seneca delves into the importance of being absent for the good of a Stoic philosopher. But he has this light and breezy lead in, you might say. And I can see where the occasional discourse that you see in the Pauline letters also function similarly. So I'm doing that in chapter 3 to bring out, you might say, a fictive nature of the letters. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. I think I emailed you a few examples before we did this interview of people that seem to be fictive in the
Hmm.
writings, and I wanted to just mention Apollonius of Tyana because this guy is pretty much contemporaneous to the rise of the gospel materials. And uh, Dr. Richard C. Miller is a buddy of mine, also likes to look at Apollonius as like an analog, like someone heuristically to look at with Jesus. And he says Apollonius famously vanished while in public trial, standing in court before the Emperor Domitian, and instantly reappeared in Puteoli, nearly 150 miles south. People speak of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. Anyway, it's a little bit off this topic, but like, I guess what I'm getting at is a lot of this stuff. Damas, right, who wrote a lot of his materials down, plays into this letter writing in Philostratus, if you will. Supposedly wrote it down on tablets, but Philostratus is having these dialogues where Apollonius is communicating with his disciples, and like it's not maybe the same as the Seneca. That's probably the closest example, would you say, to the Pauline letters?
Well, I focus on Seneca because we know there are fictive letters, and Seneca is a known very good writer. So we can see strategies in Seneca that we may not see so strongly in other letter writers. Seneca, you might say, is an expert, expert letter writer. So, what does an expert letter writer do with letters? That was my question going
Mhm.
in. Um, I don't know that the writers of the Pauline letters um, were at the level of Seneca. But there's still, you could still see that they are employing some of the same strategies, and maybe more unconsciously, one could say, than Seneca. I think Seneca is consciously exploiting the genre. He knows the power of the literature
Right.
to create certain effects. Perhaps less so with the Pauline epistographers, but they were still trained writers, I would say, for sure. You can't just do this without training.
Exactly. Okay, so how do we deal with the supposed evidence of Paul's letters getting mentioned by Second Peter, the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, the Ignatian letters, and First Clement? Your book deals with this, but like this is where some of these scholars try to anchor early mentions of these letters early enough. I mean, late first century, early second century. How do we deal with that
Right,
evidence?
right. And I've been asked that before. It's a great question. And you're right to mention these writings because they seemingly then would disconfirm my part of my thesis is that the Pauline letters don't appear until the mid second century, when all of those witnesses that you just mentioned are conventionally dated to the early second century, to around 100, right?
Mhm.
And they have provide evidence of Pauline letters, and in some cases they provide evidence what we think of as a collection of Pauline letters. In fact, I think it's all from a collection. All the evidence is from a collection because we don't have evidence of letters in unities. There's no manuscripts of just Romans or just Philippians. Whatever evidence we have and from whenever time is collected letters. So you could say these witnesses then are making references to collected letters. So for that scholarship to work, the conventional scholarship to work, you'd need a collection of Pauline letters to just before that time, right? To
Mhm.
100. And that's what the scholarship has relied upon. There must have been a collection of Pauline letters at 100 because, after all, we have First Clement, we have Second Peter, we have the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, and they're dated early. But what's happened more recently is those witnesses that I've just mentioned, some are now dated later. And that's just thanks to some recent scholarship that's now reconsidering. A lot of these things are being reconsidered. Dating is being reconsidered. Perhaps that happens all the time, but it's certainly happening now. So this allows, you might say, or it puts less stress, another way of saying it, on there having to be a collection of Pauline letters dated to 100, because now those witnesses are later. So if the
Mhm.
witnesses are later, the collection can emerge later, right? So this is how I would respond. And I do land, if you will, on Marcion, because that's the first firm evidence we have, even though it's secondary evidence of a collection of letters, and it dates to just before 150. That dating is maybe not the firmest either, but I would say mid-second century.
And just for viewers, like honestly, we're gonna blast through a few questions here, but you really should read the book. I mean, there's so much material in these sections that help you understand why scholars think Ignatius is early, why John B. Lightfoot. Like, there's all sorts of great stuff you cover. And again, we just don't have the time to get into the weeds. Plus, you got to get the book. I mean, come on, you wanted to like literally just read the book to you here? No, we have a lot of material, and it's impossible to cover it all. So let's move to the next one, if that's okay with you, Nina. Are you okay with that?
Sure.
If Paul's letters are second century invention, how do we understand his theology? This is a big, it's this like really powerful question. I think needs to be at least considered. And you've been thinking through Paul for many years, so I almost want your personal opinion, right? If you can, giving me a little details of what you think is going on in these letters. But anyway, many current scholars argue that Paul was not breaking away from Judaism. Yet some see Paul's letters radically breaking from it. We got into Bauer a little bit, cessationism. But if we follow your observations, how do we understand this character Paul and his teachings in light of Jewish pagan ideas? Would the school of Marcion really craft these up and have a Paul within Judaism? Or is it more likely he would reflect some sort of Marcion-like theology? That's assuming the audience knows what Marcion-like theology is. But I guess, does this rekindle, or does this does this hinder or hurt the Paul within Judaism school that we see today right now? Because now, like, what are they doing? They're assuming authentic. They have this kind of theological, we're reading Paul's letters. These are theological, real audiences. He's dealing with Jews on the ground in the first century. If this is second century Christian production, how do we understand Paul's theology in light of your assessment? And it may be a bit subjective, but that's okay. I'm curious to know, how do you read Paul now?
Yeah. It's a great question. As you said, a big question. And I have kind of a short answer for you, because I think this is something that needs to be rethought. It's likely another book, another couple of books. What I have a short answer, and I have been very sympathetic to the Paul within Judaism perspective. Now that I'm rethinking the letters and wondering about the origins of the letters, and possibly relocating these letters, well, I do relocate them, and then associating them with Marcion at an early time, that does cause one to rethink. So your question is spot on, really. But as I said, it's a big question. And I think it's something that others are working on now. It's going to depend on the recreation of these Marcionite letters to really see, well, what did Marcion really write in these letters? If
Mhm.
Marcion's the writer, I say they're Marcion's school. What do those 10 letters look like? Who is the Apostle Paul in those Marcion letters? What I will say, that all the scholarship on Paul within Judaism is all based on the canonical letters. So that's another thing that we could start to look at. Again, what's the difference between the canonical letters and the Marcionite letters, and does that change the Apostle Paul and his view of Judaism? What we do know, or what we think from the recreations, that something like Romans 9 through 11, which is kind of a strategic for Paul within Judaism, they're largely lacking in Marcion's Romans. And that's where you see the Apostle Paul agonizing, right, about the Jews, the place of the Jews within God's new economy, right? So there is something there. But then also scholars have said the Marcionite letters are kind of neutral, really, on that question of Judaism, in that they retain a lot of references to Hebrew scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is it exactly? Again, I think a lot more research needs to be done in this area. It's also difficult, and another prominent Marcion scholar has said it's very difficult to decipher a particular Marcionite theology from either the gospel text that he publishes or the collection of 10 letters of Paul that he publishes. You can't really get that because all those texts look neutral, for lack of a better term. Other scholars have said that if you really want to get at Marcion's theology, you need to see his antithesis or antitheses, which is a work that he wrote with oppositions, a list of oppositions. But that's gone. There's no copy of his antitheses. It was tried to be, I think Harnack tried to recreate those, but we don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So were people supposed to be reading Paul Marcion's collection through the lens of those antitheses, and then seeing a very kind of anti-Jewish, you might say, Paul? We don't know. Or what were those antitheses the reason why other Orthodox Christian fathers, you might say, were so disturbed by Marcion, so much thought that he's a heretic? Is it because of these antitheses that they had and they read in some form or fashion that made him so antithetical to their own views of, their one God and Marcion supposedly two gods, right? So
Wow.
again, there's a lot there, and um, Marcionite scholars, stronger than me, that's for sure, could probably answer that question a lot better.
I think that was brilliantly answered. Again, to the
Oh,
viewer,
thank you.
the letters we have in our New Testament, in a nutshell, what I would take away is these are polished and touched up, and at least good reason to doubt what you're reading in your New Testament is what was actually there from the outset in Paul's letters. So now you're reading theology added in, you're reading potential stuff that was not there in the original Pauline letters that seem to come from the school of Marcion. And of course, this is a complex, layered debate that we're still up, still up for grabs. Okay, why should we doubt Paul's existence? When we look at other fictional letters, we find examples, as you pointed out, Seneca. This is a real person, right?
Yeah.
But in Seneca, you pointed out there's a fictional character, right? So we can find examples of fake letters in the name of real famous people who did exist, like Plato, Aristotle, etc. Are there examples of fictional people who wrote letters that we can point to as an example?
It's interesting question. Going back to your previous point, um, I theologies are always different and change. So it doesn't invalidate the fact that one is looking at canonical letters, doesn't really invalidate certain theologies. I kind of want to push back a little bit on
Okay.
that. And then it's just, we could say there is more malleability. There's less fixity with our texts. So I think that's really more the point. The absolutism doesn't really hold so well. And I think that's what you're trying to point out. But it doesn't invalidate it. It's
Right.
just what are your assumptions? It's good to know that there were other texts out there that might say something different. So that is perhaps what I'm adding, rather than trying to disparage other views.
Got it.
Okay.
Yes.
So who else is fictional? Well, there are some fictional characters within ancient novels. And those fictional characters, you've asked me what fictional persons wrote fictive letters. So the novels, ancient novels, do provide evidence, and those are embedded letters. To be a little more technical, it's not a standalone letter. It's a letter within another document, within a novel. So Cherryton's, the characters there, write letters to each other. And then there's also a Greek novel, Achilles Tatius. There are letters in that novel as well. Herodotus's Ethiopian story, there are letters there. So there are ancient novels, so that it's less questionable, like I was saying with these moral epistles, less questionable that there are fictive letters. Well, in the novel, fictive characters are seen to write letters. So that can in part answer you. There's also, and I think this is an important point, because you have to ask, well, how do you get the idea of a letter to begin with? Why do we have so many letters in the New Testament? Is that completely new, that you would write scriptures as letters? Well, it's not, because you do have in the Hebrew Bible lots of letters. Again, they're embedded letters. So it would give, closer to home. I'm looking at biblical literature. So Hebrew scriptures is another place one can think about. And then also one can, I think now, if my thesis has any credibility, the Book of Revelation, which itself is could be considered a letter. It has a letter opening and a letter closing, but beyond that, and more important than that, it has 7 letters, Revelation, and there's 7 community letters. And to answer your question, I think it's pretty easy to say that the sender in those letters, who's envisioned as the Son of Man, okay, he and that Son of Man figure in Revelation is seen to write to the angel. You probably know that. It's Revelations 2 and 3. Those 2 chapters are taken up by those 7 letters. Angel of the church or the assembly, ecclesia, of the individual angel of the 7 individual ecclesia. So that is interesting too. Those you have letters in Revelation. You might
Mm.
also think of the Epistle of Barnabas,
It,
depending on how you want to think about Barnabas. But fictive, fictive letter, fictive inscribed sender.
this just to tack on that, I was thinking about what you said about novels having letters in them, and Pervo in his commentary seemed to do. He kind of allowed the genre of acts to be a mix of things and wasn't just one thing, but he entertained novel, right, to some degree
Right.
at least. And if that's the case, and we've been talking about acts being influential, these letters, I mean, why is it not a possible logical conclusion to kind of go, look, Acts is this novel-like historical fiction or fiction of history, whatever you want to call that. And here are these letters that are inspired by the novel-like telling of the origin of Christianity, the origin of the church and how it grew through the Holy Spirit and all that. So here are our letters that kind of are going the direction we want them to in light of Acts, the novel-like thing. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm jumping, of course, a bit here, but I'm just trying to see maybe there could be a correlation there. I don't know. Nina, I'm personally sympathetic to Jesus' mythicism, even though I get harsh criticism, like staunchly from my friends who think there was a Jesus. Though I tend to think there was a guy named Jesus, the Gospels are based off of. Can we possibly, meaning I think there's probably a guy, probably. And I just lean there. I have no way to prove it. I have good reasoning in my mind, I believe. Jews were crucified all the time. Like, this is my thinking, but I'm not going to lie. I really do not have high confidence in being overly confident where to go here, right? Can we possibly see your research leading one to doubt the historicity of Jesus?
I can, thank you for your question. I can see why you're asking that question. After you read the book, it would come to mind. So it may sound strange. I think I tend to agree with where you sit with that, with your own analysis. I haven't really spent an adequate enough time researching that, or even thinking about it to the degree that I probably should, to be able to answer that super well. But I can also see, like you can, it could have been a real person, and that what we see in the Gospels is based on a real individual, but the Gospels take that individual in completely different directions. I can see that. So the short answer is I just don't know. I'm open to that. I would suggest, though, if people are interested, to look at the scholarship on the historical Jesus, which I think is an interesting field, and even pick up some of the new scholarship on historical Jesus. And also, and related, the relationships between the Gospels, that I think is being rethought as well. But that historical Jesus is really more, gets to the answer. And I would have to get into all of that scholarship again and rethink my ideas.
Thank you so much. My final question, and ladies and gentlemen, make sure you like the video, go in the description, get the book. I hear through the grapevine, the angel Gabriel told me that if you buy the book, you have eternal salvation. This is not a ploy. I'm not pranking you. This is dead serious, right? Of course, duh. Get the book. Okay. What do you think it will take to get other scholars to see your research as the most likely, or to just engage it, like to really reevaluate it along with you?
Thank you. I haven't thought a whole lot about that. I do hope, however, that scholars will take my arguments seriously enough to at least engage, and even not going along with everything that I say, but perhaps enough to rethink this assumption about the authentic perspective. Does it really hold? If people would just ask that, that I think would already set some balls in motion, you might say. It's interesting, once you see the letters as integral to the development of Christian scriptures, things for me really started to fall into place. They didn't get more complicated with more unanswered questions. I think they simplified the picture, at least for me, to see how you could see references in those letters of events that only take place, you might say, in the first time in the Gospels. But then we're saying the Apostle Paul is already talking about those events in the mid-50s as this individual character. It doesn't line up in my conceptual framework. The authentic perspective on the letters, um, it leaves conceptual problems. So I think I would leave it at that. And I would love to see more. If I'm right, I'd love to see some more work on these interrelationships between the letters and the Gospels and Acts. I think that would be really fruitful and it could really take us into another look at Christian beginnings, Christian emergence. It would be really cool.
I agree with you. In fact, there are certain, this is going to sound kind of funny, but it's a different lens that they're viewing it at. But you're right. There are conservative, I'll call them conservative scholars, that are writing on eschatology and all this kind of stuff that I've ran across that will connect something in Matthew and go into Pauline letters and like they connect things. I don't typically see scholars in Pauline studies connect right to some of these gospels in the way that they think they're dialoguing or in some way in communication. And I think that you've got that like really conservative view, right, which has all the romanticism and the spirit kind of thing. And then you got the critical view that's like, hey, they're in dialogue. There's something going on here. And I hope more scholars will pick up the torch, even if they don't necessarily draw all the same conclusions. It'll be really cool to have like a new trend of scholarship come in and find things that maybe you haven't and complement what you've said and maybe even have differences, right? I mean, obviously, what scholar doesn't have a difference with another scholar? So, any final words from you, Nina? I really appreciate your time and the work you put into this book. It's a fantastic read. Anyone who's seriously wanting to learn about the Apostle Paul's letters, you got to get the book. Final words from you.
I don't have anything more to say, really. Your questions were good. I appreciate your interest too, and I appreciate that you're promoting my work. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see this. So I appreciate you. That's
Thank
what I'll
you.
say.
Well, we appreciate here at MythVision, ladies and gentlemen. Again, all the links are in the description. Tell me and Nina what your thoughts are about these ideas in the comments section. Share it out, get you a copy. We love you, and never forget, we are MythVision.